So a very warm welcome to this lecture, this special lecture that is being delivered by Professor Partha Dasgupta, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. The plan for the event is as follows. After my brief remarks, I will hand you over to the chair, Dr. Pushpam Kumar, Chief Economist at the United Nations Environmental Program. Dr. Pushpam Kumar is a well-known figure in the development space. I don't quite know how to introduce Pushpam, having gone back such a long way with him. So Dr. Kumar has worked very closely in the Millennium Assessment and many other areas. So Dr. Kumar will take over and chair the proceedings, introduce the speaker, and then he will moderate the question and answers. So very welcome again to this event and to Inclusive Wealth and Sustainable Development Problematics by Sir Partha Dasgupta. So Pushpam, over to you.
Thank you, Srikant. Thanks, and very happy to be here in the INSEE gathering, which is kind of homecoming for me. And thanks, INSEE President INSEE, to do this event, especially to remember Karl, Göran, Mäler. As many of you, I'm sure, would know, Karl was very, very close to this fraternity, and especially SANDEE and INSEE as well. SANDEE, of course, he along with Sir Partha, on which I'm coming in a minute, he created that forum for the South Asian researchers and scholars. But I would go a little bit back, and Karl's contributions, people can say more on that, and of course, we will hear more from Partha. But Karl Göran's Mäler contribution is not only profound in the profession of resource economics, but he was very innovative. Why I'm saying he was innovative? Because see, his first contribution, the theoretical inquiry in early 70s, was in the larger backdrop of the crisis which the international community was confronting with. You might remember that was the time when Limit to Growth, Rome Club, Jeff Forrester's book, World Dynamics came, and people were trying to understand the issue, the environmental crisis, from the lens of economics. And here is Karl Göran Mäler, who comes out and provides probably one of the most authentic methodological framework under which this issue can be understood and a possible solution can be designed and devised. And he did that. Then second, his passion for interaction with young researchers and students, that was probably unparalleled. And mentoring and trusting researchers and spending generous time naturally came to him. And that was also manifested when, of course, Sir Partha and Karl Göran started this SANDEE. But SANDEE is one. Many of you might not know, he was equally active through LACIP in South and Central America. He was active in South and Central Africa through SIPA and RANISA, and elsewhere too. He had also great interest in bringing professionals from different disciplines. But I think I had my own interaction with him in various capacities. I can't forget my probably 3 hours one-to-one talk when Karl's birthday was there, probably in February 2002 in Bangkok. And then he was some personal story, his interaction with other professionals. So one could see this man is not only a great classroom teacher and innovative researcher, but he has fondness to pass the challenges and history to the next generation, and that was really admirable. And of course, he had great interactions with researchers in South Asia, SANDEE, of course, but INSEE as well. I can't forget to mention that in 2011, probably he came to give one of the keynote speeches in Hyderabad. So well done, INSEE and SANDEE, to remember Karl, Göran, Mäler through this lecture series. I sincerely hope that this continues, and my heartfelt wishes to INSEE President and INSEE and SANDEE Coordinator to take this up. In fact, Karl Göran got several prizes and his work, but many of his work and the prizes were jointly received, or the work done with Professor Partha Dasgupta. Again, certainly I should not introduce Partha to this audience because it will take lots of time. But it will be safe to conclude in his introduction that Partha Dasgupta in last nearly 5 decades has influenced the direction of research of environment and natural resource economics. Through his research and teaching in the area of economics of environment, nutrition, demography, poverty, well-being, and nature nexus, I think he has, to some extent, shaped the DNA of this discipline. I think, and this is absolutely no exaggeration. Partha, of course, has got several prizes and laurels. Of course, Volvo, Blue Planet, Tylers, at least, Q Prize very recently from the Royal Botanical Gardens in UK. Also, he got knighthood in 2002 from the Queen's in UK. Many more. And but his expertise in engaging with policymakers have been phenomenal, and that was much needed. Coming from UN agencies, I can tell you, we don't have much quality people who are sound, credible researchers, and at the same time, they have in the same length, they can communicate to the policymakers at the global level, at the national levels, and influence the action on the ground. That is what we need more than any time in the previous history. And Partha has done it successfully. The path-breaking work which he laid for the UK's HM Treasury, the economics, the review of economics of biodiversity, known famously now as Dasgupta Review, has been influencing not only the government, but multilateral trust bank, the fund, and several other agencies. Hopefully, we will see the desired outcome in coming years. One more thing I would like to say here, that Partha has been advising many governments, but recently he has been invited by the topmost UN bodies, chaired by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General himself, to advise how to bring wealth or GDP plus or natural capital into the larger UN forum. Please remember that means all the 36, 38 UN agencies who, irrespective of their focus, they have to understand and bring natural capital in their operation, research, priorities, and program implementation in various countries and in their thoughts as well. So that is a great thing which has happened, and I think we are so proud of that. One of our teacher, one of our colleague, one of our guru, guide, mentor is there to help us. I think I should not take more than this time and invite Professor Partha Dasgupta to say something about Karl Göran, but also the substantial topic, which is GDP plus or inclusive wealth and sustainable development, which he has chosen to speak on. We are grateful to you, Sir Partha, to join us. Thank you very much.
I don't know how to begin with that absolutely wonderful introduction, Pushpa. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. We've been close friends for years. And I have so many friends in the audience, I can imagine, many of whom probably have been my students through SANDEE workshops. We're honoring Karl-Göran Mäler, and I think Pushpam has summarized his work and his, in some sense, his attitude to work brilliantly. So in a way, I can cut short that aspect of it, give a few reflections on what made him such an astonishing personality. I think one of the key things about his personality was that he was happy, contented within his own skin. He didn't have what currently we talk about, use the expression hang up. He loved life, and that shone through always. There was always a laughter, and he could carry the laughter well because he was quite stout. I wouldn't say fat, but he was over the years, he put on some weight, and I used to tease him about it. Then he would retort by saying, "You wait till you get to my age." So we were very, very close friends. We first met in 1979 at a meeting at UNEP, of all places, as Pushpam is sharing this, at a meeting in UNEP. And we met at the airport as we were landing at Nairobi airport and took a taxi ride together to our hotel. We had never met before, but we had heard of each other. And one of the first things he suggested was, look, why don't we dump our luggage and go to the game park? There's one in 20 minutes drive or 30 minutes drive from the hotel, which we then did. So that suggests to you exactly the way his mind worked. He loved nature. It's not surprising given he was born in sort of, I wouldn't say northern Sweden, but quite a bit north of Stockholm. A lot of forest, as you see. Mushroom collecting was one of his habits. But I think his greatness lay, in my judgment, in something that Pushpam has hinted at, is that in a way, the teacher in him won over the researcher in him, the scientist in him. And when I say that, I don't mean that he was not a scientist. He was a scientist of the highest order. But he was not into publications. If you look at his CV, it's pretty thin. Thin in terms of numbers of publications. Because for him, he got bored of a problem after he has licked it. And many of our articles, joint articles, and we wrote quite a lot, quite a number, I think about 15 or so. I haven't checked, but it's about that over a period, maybe even more. I'm not doing any injustice to his, in fact, I'm complimenting him. They wouldn't have been written had I not done it. The drafting was done always by me because he would say, now let's have a drink. And why don't you do a draft and I'll have a look at it. But meanwhile, what would you like to drink? So that was the way we operated. This lecture is on measurement of beyond GDP. And I would like to say a little bit about how it came about that I like to think one of our best papers was on the wealth accounting. And I think those of us who are economists here would see how scientific ideas can grow out of completely without any deliberation. Accounting for economic performance is, of course, a commonplace activity now. It's very commonly done. But on the whole, I have this feeling, the thing that really bothered Karl and me. Karl was an economic theorist of the highest order, very pristine. Everything needs to have a theoretical basis before we can do any application. Likewise, with regard to measurement of well-being or economic measurement, Why are we measuring it? What's it serving? How does it fit in with welfare economics, our basic foundational ideas of economic thinking? So we used to sort of laugh over drinks and saying, well, look, people just invent measures to suit their prejudices. So one day it may be this, another day it may be that. And in fact, we used to be quite critical of the UNDP's Human Development Index for the same reason, that basically you say, well, we care about health. What is health? How can health be replicated? Okay, life expectancy, and something else we care about, education. And then you put them together into an index to see whether no question is asked as to whether it fits in with our general notion of social well-being. It's not a criticism, it's a very commonplace thing, and it's a very reasonable thing to do. It's not, but for Karl, and I guess myself, since I'm a theorist as well, we wanted to see whether we could get a measurement, economic measure, stemming out of foundational ideas of human well-being. That's to say, a measure which would mimic human well-being, of course, across the generations, human well-being across the generations, because both Karl and I were deeply interested in the intergenerational problem, the dynamical system that the human economy involves. Now, this question had been raised by several other people before. And the reason why I'm giving you this little anecdote is that it tells us the power of theorizing. And Marty Weitzman had a very famous paper on net national product. And that was based on economic theory in the sense of foundational. He looked at the Hamiltonian of optimization exercises, because the Hamiltonian dynamics was the one which really led the way in dynamical economics from the 1960s onwards, and has continued to do so. The first thing you do when you write down an optimization exercise is write down the Hamiltonian with all the constraints and so forth, but that's the Hamiltonian which is to be maximized, okay? And Marty rightly pointed out that this is, of course, you want to see whether maximizing the Hamiltonian can actually reflect intergenerational welfare. It was staring at you in the face because you're maximizing it after all. So you can continue to maximize it. You'll be maximizing the intergenerational welfare in the form of, let's say, in the form of a Ramsey integral. But of course, he ran into one problem, which is the Hamiltonian is the utility plus net investment. And utility is not the same as consumption, whereas NDP would be consumption plus net investment. So he did something which I wouldn't have done. And of course, Karl was absolutely scathing about it. He says, let's suppose utility is linear in consumption. Well, then, of course, utility is the same as consumption, and you've got net national product. And so for a long while, net national product was seen as the index that you want to look at. But of course, now notice you've suddenly decided to abandon the idea that the poor people should have a higher weight in their income than the rich person. In other words, diminishing marginal utility. That causes problems. In other words, you have to add the consumer surplus. And that's, of course, measurement problems abound. Now, what Karl and I did was very simple. We were actually having a drink, as usual, and we were fooling around with optimization exercises. And one of us, and I cannot now remember whether he or I, probably he, said, well, what does the Bellman formulation give us? Bellman, of course, predated Pontryagin as a route to optimizing problems. And he had what's known as a value function. So what you want trying to maximize is the value, which is value means actually intergenerational welfare. That's exactly what value is. The value function in the Bellman is the Ramsey integral if you're maximizing utilities. But the value function, what he showed, Bellman showed, was that it was a function of all the stocks of capital assets at the date at which value is being maximized. So the idea is, like the Hamiltonian, you're maximizing the value function at each date, but the value function, of course, depends on the capital stocks. Well, of course, with the moment I was reminded of the value function, one of us, and probably in this case me, because Karl was probably drinking, pouring wine, I differentiated the value function with respect to the capital assets, the partial derivatives. And of course, that tells us immediately that you're looking at something like wealth, because you're looking, the partial derivatives are the accounting prices of the capital assets. multiplied by the change in the capital assets will be the effective change in the value function. So if you're in maximizing the value function, you're essentially choosing projects, investment projects and policies so as to maximize wealth. That's the background of the theorem. And of course, it took us a long while to work through the implications of it now, it's an airtight theory. It's an equivalence theorem, says that wealth is not the same as inclusive wealth, to use Pushpam's term. We used the term comprehensive, but Pushpam is a more powerful person than Karl, Göran, and I, and his usage of the term inclusive has won the day, and I've used it in my review also. So the reason we should take inclusive wealth really seriously, and everything should follow from it, is the equivalence theorem. Inclusive wealth is not the same as intergenerational well-being or well-being across the generation, but they are related to each other in an intrinsic way. If one goes up through a policy change, the other goes up by the same policy change. If one goes down due to a policy change, the other goes down as well. They mimic each other. But of course, in inclusive wealth, you're looking at the stocks of capital assets, not well-being. So then you might ask, where's the connection between well-being and the stocks? Accounting prices. Of course, that's what it is, because the accounting prices depend on your social values, your wealth, your welfare judgments. So that's the theorem, and that's why we make use of it. We should make use of it, and why we should now abandon GDP as a measure of intergenerational well-being. We should not be saying treasuries, finance ministries, planning commissions in particular, ought to be asking themselves, what are we leaving behind at the end of the year for the following year as compared to what we had inherited in terms of stocks of assets in the previous year? Now, of course, it's not going to be possible to estimate inclusive wealth with the kind of authority that you would be able to, we have now assumed for GDP, because many of these prices are these are accounting prices. And for natural capital, I don't have to remind you, it's going to be very difficult. There are lots and lots of accounting prices which will be missing, continue to be missing. So you'll have to take shortcuts. One reason people separate out natural capital from physically produced capital and human capital and think of them three separately, as Kumar and Managi did in the Inclusive Wealth Report of 2018, which was published on the auspices of the United Nations Environment Programme with their blessing, so to speak, took that attitude. They split up these three types of capital assets and looked at their movements over time. And I'll show you in a minute in fact, I'll ask for it now. Can I ask for slide 4, please? Slide, the one below. 5, sorry, 5. Yes, so this is taken from Managi Kumar's, and the period we're looking at is 1990 to 2014. And look at the way the world economy has moved, with all the caveats, by the way. These numbers are not to be believed, but they are to be used. They're very valuable, because if you don't believe them, you will say, just ignore the last of the 3 curves. Okay, that's a very bad idea. When I say they are not to be believed, these are extremely approximate, but that you should be, that's an assertion, not an admission, because not much money has been spent in trying to estimate these things. Can think of in comparison to the amount of money that has been spent on GDP estimates over the last 70 years. So these are all rough, but what does it say? It says per capita produced capital has grown by, has doubled in that period, 1990 to 2014. This is global capital stocks, okay, per capita has doubled. Human capital has increased by about 13 to 15%. But natural capital has declined by 40%. And of course, this is completely consistent with all the other kinds of information we have from the ecology side, earth sciences side, that the pace, the direction of economic movement throughout the world has been one of accumulating produced capital and human capital and bypassing nature, because for the most part, nature is seen as free and has been ignored, okay? And the imprint of this feature, this is only for a brief period, and I will show you a better set of slides in a minute in terms of the direction, the intellectual basis for economic development over the past 70 years has been one in which you've essentially concentrated, you've ignored natural capital for one reason or the other, okay? In some sense, our association at which this lecture is being delivered, let's say, shouldn't exist if you really want to take the growth and development economics and the economics of poverty as is currently practiced. Now, this ignoring of natural capital, was it justified? Were they very stupid all through, economists that is? I want to, this is a time not to have confrontation. I want to understand the moves that were made by our previous generation of economists, Harrod, Domar, Solow, back in the 50s. What was reasonable at that time to think in fashioning growth models, if you like? I want to suggest that it was not unreasonable for them to ignore natural capital. I don't, by the way, my guess is they didn't even think about it. So I'm being really charitable here. I'm saying that even if they had thought about it and engaged with ecologists, but at that time, remember, the ecology was a very fresh subject. There's not much there in 1950, if I want to, okay? Even then, I'd like to argue that there was a justification. And I'd like to show you the first 3 slides, please. First slide, this is global GDP from 1750 to 2019 at 2011 prices, and of course, PPP, okay? Notice how it takes off. About 1950, you have an incredible rise in global GDP. Until then, the world economy was small, about 8 trillion international dollars or so. Today, it's about 120, 130, depending on how you measure it. So we are talking about a 13-fold increase in GDP. And I'm using GDP now as in measure of economic world and human activity. And, okay, and human activity is, of course, what makes demands on Mother Nature. So at that time, I would argue that it seems very reasonable that we were small in relation to the biosphere. So in retrospect, it doesn't look exactly wrong to have thought so. Can I have the second one? The second one is real GDP per capita. And again, you see a similar picture, that for a long while, from 1750 onwards, Industrial Revolution onwards, a lot of things were happening, but per capita global income was not rising very much until 1900. Then it started rising until 1950. And then from 1950, again, it took off. Our standard of living has grown by a factor of 5 or so, okay, in that 70-year period. And if you look at the third slide, please, it gives you global population. And again, you see 1950, roughly speaking, as a turning point of human numbers. 1950 population of the world was about 2.5 billion. Today, it's 7.8 billion. So when people like myself take demographic issues very seriously, it's because of these factors. Now, these 3 diagrams, of course, tell us fantastic thing. Human numbers, per capita income rising, and human numbers rising. It seems to be a glorious time for the human economy. And you have many, many books extolling the virtues of the last 70 years. And rightly so, too. We have been my generation has been extremely fortunate. Health is much better. We eat better food and so forth. Globally, of course, I'm talking now averages. We can talk about distribution later, and I will in a few minutes. But that is the situation. And you can see why now ecologists coming from the earth sciences think of 1950 as approximately the time humanity entered the Anthropocene. and something has happened, the accumulation has been incredibly high. Now, I don't need to point out that one of the implications of this, the neglect, has been that this growth spurt, this greatly beneficial changes that took place, we regard as beneficial only when seen from our own point of view, because it's per capita income which has been growing. Our standard of living has been increasing in a big way. But of course, we've done it by mining nature and by transforming nature from putting pressure on maintenance and regulating services that Mother Nature offers, which are like the basic industry, if you like, source of all the food, water, timber, fibers that we enjoy, away from the pressure that on the provisioning goods that we demand, which makes for GDP, have been at the expense of the maintenance and regulating services. And I don't need to elaborate on that because you know it as well as I do, and possibly even better. Okay, so there's a tension between these two broad categories of services Mother Nature offers us: provisioning goods on the one hand, maintenance and regulating services on the other. And maintenance regulating services, I mean, climate regulation, decomposition of waste, water purification, nitrogen fixation, and so forth. Many of these objects that are services that are coming through the forests, through the soils, under the soils, and so forth. Okay, the wetlands and the mangroves and all of these ecosystems that you study, SANDEE studies, INSEE studies, that's the right thing to look at. Now, in my review, of course, I've seen the economics of biodiversity as the economics of the biosphere. I haven't taken biodiversity as the unit of account, the unit that drives the object that drives the review are ecosystems, because they are capital assets. I've basically transformed the subject of biodiversity to an asset management problem. So we are back to wealth, which I began and how Karl was involved in it. So the Karl appears in the review in a big way through this transformation of the problem that we face of the human economy in terms of the asset management. Okay. So now what I want to do is to can I have the next slide of probably the following slide, not the fourth but the fifth. Yes, just keep to that. What we did, what I've done in the review, and I'll just be very brief because I want to use that in my last few minutes, 15 minutes or so, to look through three issues, apply it for three economic problems. Although I talked about wealth as being the key index, I also said that because wealth is hard to measure, very often we'll have to cut corners. And the virtue of having the equivalence theorem that I just mentioned is that when you cut corners, you need to know what corners you're cutting. Whose corners are you cutting? So the corner I'm cutting now is to say, well, let's have a look at natural capital. What are we doing to it? And what is nature capable of offering us? So on the left-hand side, in that you see a formula which is capital N times small y divided by alpha is greater than G of S. The left-hand side, capital NY divided by alpha, is the human imprint. Ehrlich and Holdren in their famous 1971 paper called it the impact. Some people call it ecological footprint. I don't, these are equivalents, or you could say the demands we make on Mother Nature. What I've got on the numerator, capital N times Y, is simply global GDP. Total number, human numbers multiplied by average GDP, and then divided by alpha, which is an efficiency parameter. And Y, remember, is a measure of the final goods and services measured in terms of market prices. But what we're taking from Mother Nature are services, okay? Goods and services. So you need a transformation, and that alpha is my transformation factor. And alpha, the higher the alpha, it could be seen as the efficiency with which we transform Mother Nature's goods and services into final products. And the higher is alpha, the lower would be our demand for the same amount of capital N times Y. The right-hand side is Mother Nature's ability to supply goods and services Again, aggregated with accounting prices. So I've got a scalar measure inequality here. But if you don't like that, well, then write down a vector of inequalities for each of the services that Mother Nature offers us, whether it's climate regulation, whether it's waste disposal, and so forth. Okay, G is the regenerative function of the biosphere, the flow of goods and services, which of course depends on the stock. So that's the background. That's my biospheric regeneration, the impact inequality, as I call it. The demand exceeds the supply, sustainable supply, which means, of course, that stock declines because Mother Nature has to. We're taking more from Mother Nature than she's capable of giving, so she declines in health. That's the idea. So long as this inequality is positive, you've got a problem. And today, one estimate of the gap is that the ratio of the left-hand side and the right-hand side is approximately 1.6. That's one estimate of the global footprint network. 1.6 means that's another way of saying we need 1.6 Earths to meet the demands that we make on a sustainable basis. Okay, now I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes, and I'll take you through with looking at a few implications of this. Notice this inequality is taking us away from wealth to one component of wealth, namely natural capital, and asking, well, how are we managing that part of our wealth? Okay, and then if somebody says, why are you interested in this? Well, the answer is because natural capital is part of our entire inclusive wealth. And so if that's declining in a big way, then of course our wealth, global wealth, must be declining unless the other two parts of wealth are increased even faster than the decline in natural capital, which nobody believes is the case at the moment. Okay, so that's the background. I want to use now for several applications. First, one of the main reasons for this inequality is, of course, that much of nature is free. These externalities, these adverse externalities that we inflict on other people for each of our actions, adds up to a gap between demand and supply. Okay, nature is missing in our Islam population, or in the deeper sense of the maintenance and regulated services. I don't mean that agricultural produce is necessarily badly marketed. They have prices for that. Land has price, yes. But remember, this agricultural land encroaches on the maintenance and regulated services. So I'm on strong grounds here. Think of export. The first example I want to give of the use of this kind of reasoning, asset management reasoning, is comes out of the recognition that about 50% or so of the biodiversity, of the global biodiversity, is in the tropics. It's rich in flora and fauna. Moreover, the tropics are also the home of the world's poorest people. Africa, for example, it's central. The African forests and the steppes and the savannas. The two together are a potent combination, because when a poor country exports primary products to rich countries, which is of course the direction of trade, that's one direction of trade, then to the extent that the adverse externalities in mining the primary products, or producing the minor products, these adverse externalities are not included in the export price, which means that the export price is underpriced. That is to say, price is below the social cost of supplying these primary products. If that's the case, translated into inclusive wealth language, it means that export of primary products from poor countries to rich countries, say timber, coffee, or you name it, carry with them a transfer of wealth from poor countries to rich countries. It's a hidden transfer. It's not exploitation necessarily. It's simply a reflection of adverse externalities. So this is another way of arguing that export carries with it a burden of a transfer from wealth from poor to the rich countries, and therefore a degradation of the ecosystems of the exporting countries. Now think of the implications for that, for development advice. Africans in particular are being urged to raised their exports in order to be able to finance the investment required for their growth of GDP, which is a standard way of thinking. But if each move in that direction leads to an erosion of their wealth, it's like climbing up an escalator at a speed which is matched by the speed at which the escalator is descending without your doing anything about it. So you're not actually making a move. It may well be that you'll be sinking yourself more and more. So from this, I judge that the economics of biodiversity tells us that we should be very wary of the idea of free trade. The free trade argument is based on the idea that every commodity has a competitive price, just price. That's when it's really efficient. But when so many markets are missing, as in the case of nature, then of course that's not true. So that's my first example. And yet, of course, this entire chain of reasoning, which I've given to in 3 minutes, I don't know the magnitude of the wealth transfer, by the way. And the reason I don't know is because it's not been done. We can try and do that by looking at the kind of work that Sandee did some years ago over small things, ecosystems, such as, for example, shrimp farms, the externalities that cultivated shrimp farms have on the mangroves and so forth. That has been estimated 10, 12, 15% distortion. But those are, of course, small case studies. And what we really need is an assault on this entire area of research to see how much of wealth is being transferred from poor to rich countries through the trade business. Second one I want to discuss is a result which has really made me a bit depressed in some sense, because it sort of goes around it, which is, can I have the next slide if I've sent it? I can't remember if I have. Yes, this is it. So suppose you were to look at the demand we make on Mother Nature as a function of our income. Let's say, call it the ecological footprint, the left-hand side as a function of income. Now I'm disaggregating. I'm not looking at global measures. Okay. Now, this one, which we estimated for the Dasgupta review, shows, well, of course, rich people have a bigger footprint than poor people. But the key question that needs to be asked is, what is the shape of this function? And it turns out to be concave, as you can see. Okay. So now the problem is, so although rich people have a bigger imprint in absolutes to poor people in terms of the demands we make on Mother Nature, at the margin, it's smaller. At the margin, which is of course what matters. Because if you're an egalitarian and you say there should be redistribution of income, then $1 taken from a rich person and given to a poor person will make the combined footprint go up, not down. So there's a tension here between egalitarianism and our imprint on nature. This is a depressing result because we like to think that there's a win-win for everything. Okay, you want this and you want that. It'll be nice if you can get that when you go for this, or you get more of this if you go for that. Here, there's a tension. In other words, you have to lower the average income if you go for egalitarian distribution. So this comes straight from the economics of inequality, and of course, but it's applied in a different footage. That is to say, it's on the footprint as a function of income. Third example that I want to talk about is something which I've written a lot of in the last few months since the review was published. And in fact, the review, of course, has this as a major recommendation, but it's so far away from discourse that I want to flag it here, which is that we have amongst Sandee's work, and many of you who are listening to this lecture and attending this conference are rightly work on local problems. And in fact, the greatness of Sandee's research, by the way, I should tell you one thing as an aside, just because I'm very proud of that fact. It makes my review somewhat distinct from work in mainstream economics. And that is the work that Sandee has done, and the work that Renessa, the other groups that Pushpa mentioned, that Karl was so influential in creating. That work is reflected in my review in a big way. I have made huge use of the quantitative research that has been done at the local level of how communities have shaped their local ecosystems, how the interaction between the state and communities and so forth. That entire edifice of work is really missing in mainstream environmental and resource economics as published in the West. And I'm really rather proud that I knew this literature well. I've been involved in it. And so it has full reflection in it. And if you look at the table of references, 100 pages of, you'll find a lot of references to your own works. So that's something I'm very proud of. If you ask, so these are the local ones, but now suppose you think in terms of the global resources. There are two classes of global public goods which we want to think about. One, exemplified by the open oceans, open seas, beyond the 200-mile EEZ, exclusive economic zone. They're global public goods because without the oceans we had sunk, absolutely sunk. I mean, the biosphere would be completely transformed if life in the oceans were to be degraded to, really degraded, okay? I, in fact, asked one of the first questions I asked of the Natural History Museum's science director at the start of my review. I asked what would happen if all life in the oceans were to be slaughtered? What would happen then? And he came back very quickly, and in fact, I referred to it in my review, saying that, of course, probably bacteria will be the only things that will survive, because they can survive anything, pretty much anything, okay? So they're great, and they're an open access resource subject to the tragedy of the commons, okay? That's pretty straightforward. We don't pay for the use of the oceans. And yet we, of course, use it horrendously. That is to say, billions of dollars of container ships, container goods, goods in containers are shipped across the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean annually. There is a huge amount of fishing that goes on, and these fisheries have externalities which you're familiar with. You read about it in the newspapers. Big trawlers trawling, destroying the bottom layers of the ocean. That's there. And then, of course, we use the oceans as a dumping ground for our pollutants. Pollutants that come from the land, through the rivers, into the oceans. Okay, so that's one area. The second type of global public good I want to talk about, I want to contrast it with, are the tropical rainforests. The rainforests of the Western Ghats, the Amazonia, Congo, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth. They are global public goods. Huge amounts of the maintenance and regulating services are being mediated by them. The only difference is, however, with regard difference from the oceans, is that they are within national jurisdiction. So the international law as it stands, Brazil has a right to do what she wants with the forest in her territory, and she does. Okay, now we complain that the Amazon is being destroyed at a rate which is furious. We all do. We worry. We moan and groan. But of course, the counter argument from them is that, look, who are you to tell us what we should do? You moaning, groaning because it's a global public good. But on the other hand, we are a small part of the world. Why should we be responsible for the whole lot of you? And so we need to develop, and you guys like to eat beef, so we have cattle ranches in what used to be pristine forest. You like soybeans, so we have soybean plantations, and so forth. Who are you to tell us? We need to generate employment, investable surplus, and all the items that you know from development economics, okay? Now, you may or may not subscribe to the political views of these countries. That's a different matter. But there's a logic there. The logic being that the global benefits exceed the local benefits of the rainforest, local being the national benefits of the rainforest. So now take this latter case. What should we do? Well, it seems to me the obvious thing is for the global community to pay these countries for ecological services, payment for ecosystem services. And that would be saying, we have an agreement whereby you desist from deforesting. But of course, there'll be an annual payment made and there'll be a bargaining problem, and God knows how difficult it is. But the fact is, that's life. That should be what is in order. Who pays for it? Well, the first class, the open access resources, has a rather similar solution, a simple solution. They're open access, so they're free and they're overused. So the right thing to do is to charge for their use. Fishing companies, shipping companies, and so forth, you ought to pay rent for the right to transfer these billions of dollars of goods across the oceans. That management needs to be done by some international organization. Now, at the moment, and I'll finish with this, at the moment, that's not the route we are taking. With climate change, it's not an international institution that's been created. What's happening is that countries, nations, are coming to agreements about how they manage their emissions. That's what's going on, okay? And then whether they use prices or quotas or transferable permits is their business, but they take, zero emission targets. They are made on a national basis. And the idea would be that if they cohere, then the global emission will be curtailed to the point of, say, 1.5 or 2 degrees or whatever, okay? That's the way they've gone. They haven't said we ought to have an international institution which will levy a charge for emitting carbon into the atmosphere of, say, $40 a ton or whatever is the current. So the discussion has been going in that way. Over the oceans, there's been no discussion, as far as I know, of any significance. There are noises made, but nothing of significance. But if we had an institution which could charge for it, that would raise billions of dollars a year of revenue. When I say raise, for humanity, there it is. It'll be our money, everybody's money, because the oceans are common property. That could be used for God knows how many useful things. Among other things would be to pay for the ecosystem services that nations which house the rainforests to pay for their protection. Unfortunately, this is not on the table. COP26 hasn't discussed it, COP15 hasn't discussed it, and yet to me, these are gaping holes in the international discussion on the global commons and on these biodiversity losses that we are suffering. So I thought I'd use this occasion to give you these 3 examples to show how looking at the problem of biodiversity loss and climate change could be seen as asset management problems. In a way, climate change hasn't really, the economics of climate change hasn't seen it as climate change as embedded in the totality of services that Mother Nature offers us. And that has been, I think, a great misfortune in that literature, in terms of the fact that it has isolated one service from the others. And the problem is, of course, these services that Mother Nature gives us are complementary to one another. They're not independent of one another. You can't isolate it. Complementary means if you dig a hole into one, the others start collapsing as well. So seeing the biosphere as a gigantic capital asset seems to me the right way to think about the economics of biodiversity and the right way to think about the human economy. In some deep sense, the work that Sandee and others and scholars in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America have done has been in the right direction. And I'm sorry to say, my colleagues in the West have not gone in that direction, to their loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Partha. If you can remove the staff, can you remove these slides from the screen so that I can see? So that was fabulous, absolutely as expected from you. So kind of you. Thanks very much. We do have several questions, and in the interest of time, it will be helpful if we club them up under 2, 3 broad categories. One set of question is definitional, the coverage of the assets, the semantics. I will come to that in a minute, but let's take some question which would certainly be in the fitness of thing, if you can say substantially on the issues. One of them is coming from, I hope audience don't mind if I read their name, Mausami Datta. that in figure 6, Sir Partha, you are referring to a non-linear relationship. How important is non-linearity in creating irreversibility in economy-environment relationship and making attaining sustainable development difficult? That is one. The second is, again, that goes from Professor Gopal Kadikodi, that the relationship between ecological footprint and GDP in figure 6, again on the same issue, in your review. For reason of statistical errors, if we treat the last 4 or 5 country data with over $60,000 and above our what is outlier, the question is the true curve will in fact become convex and not concave. Do you agree? I think I will keep these 2 questions and wait for your response. Then we'll go to the rest. Over to you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. First of all, the nonlinearity. The nonlinearity that was reflected in the convex relationship between ecological footprint and income is very different from the nonlinearity that the question was pointing to, directing my attention to, which is the nonlinearity of the processes that shape nature's goods and services. Okay. So the ecosystem processes are nonlinear, and that's absolutely sure, absolutely clear. And that is why in my review, there's so much discussion of these nonlinearities. Chapter 4 is full of it. Chapter 3 is full of it, actually. And then I make use of it in chapter 4. Chapter 3 is essentially a chapter on ecology, on natural processes. I exemplify it mathematically, complete story in the context of lakes, freshwater lakes, and how they get degraded when too much phosphorus enters into them from adjoining agricultural fields. Yes, the nonlinearities are extremely important. Extremely important because, of course, they also suggest the presence of tipping points, and something that is very prominent in the work of earth scientists, particularly global climate change, the nonlinearity of the climate system, amongst others, give reasons for thinking that there are real problems ahead for humanity. And of course, the choice of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and so forth are based on the idea that thus far, no farther. If you go beyond that, there are some real dangers ahead, non-linear dangers ahead, big tipping points ahead. Now, one of the arguments that is often provided is that these are like crying wolf, at least today it's probably not so, but 20 years ago, certainly they were, it's from the work of Lomborg and others, it could be writings of Lomborg and others, that you're calling, it's always tomorrow that the problem lies, tomorrow or day after, it's not today. And I think one of the great features, and I keep on coming back to the wonderful work that is being done in South Asia, less in Africa and Latin America, I'm sorry to say, but South Asia is a really, Sandee and your own institution in society together are producing some of the best works and have been producing for 30, 40 years. I can come back to that later. When I first went to the Institute of Economic Growth in 1982 and spent a year there, spent a term there, I learned more from them than anybody else. They knew no theory. They were not at all interested in theory, but boy, oh boy, did they know a lot about groundwater. And that was very interesting to me. Okay, so the greatness of the work that's come from South Asia, from you all and students, and many of my students at Sandee, has been the fact that these nonlinearities have been observed at the local level. So we are not talking about future problems for the global economy only. If you focus your attention, use the lens on small communities, well, they've seen these tipping points. They've seen the implications of nonlinearity. How else do you Kadikodi's own work on distress migration? You're just staring at it in the face. So yes, they're extremely important, nonlinearities. And as I say, these are not for the future. They have been experienced. African migration patterns, distress migration within the continent and out of it, It's very fashionable to say it's due to governance failure, because that's the sort of that's a sort of drawing room way of talking. It's governance failure. Then you sort of blame it on some general feature of the rulers. Okay, but the source of the stress comes from the fact that, you know, your biomass is shrinking, your cattle are shriveling, and you need more space. The rains haven't come, and you need more space, and you encroach upon your neighbors, and their neighbors are very poor. They're facing the same kind of stress. Net result, there is conflict, and people move. So yes, extremely important, but that's different from the nonlinearity in the diagram, chapter 6. Second,
Sorry, go ahead.
The second one was the concave convex. I haven't seen the data on the convex part that you mentioned for high income level. I'm willing to believe it, certainly. When you see these luxury yachts that the super rich have, I'm willing to believe it becomes convex. And if it becomes convex, then of course the reverse argument comes along. Egalitarian moves will be helpful. That's what I'm saying. I only used the one which Bushbaum and Managi supplied. And that's very aggregate data. It's not based on nations, I think, in some ways. But anyway, so that's there's no dispute on that. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Then the second set of questions, they come from Nainan, who is asking, in your review, how does the importance of social capital has been highlighted in your review? Does it underrate or overlook the importance of social capital, especially in managing natural capital? So that is one. Then P. Balakrishnan is asking, can you define the inclusive of the idea of inclusive wealth? That could go longer. Then another question is from Chandrakant asking, what percentage of adverse externalities is reflected in the market price in the world? That could be a tough one, though. Then the other question is coming from Ravi Agrawal saying, if agricultural or primary commodity export prices internalize the value of natural capital, then how the international demands for goods from developing countries would look like, whether they would decline or increase, or is there any policy recommendation on this in your review? So this is a wide range of questions, technically might follow from your review or might not follow, but please feel free to handle them if you want to.
No, absolutely. I'm very happy to look at these. These are 3 sets of questions and I've written them down, so that's fine. And of course, remember, I began by saying that my review is not so much the economics of biodiversity, but the economics of biosphere. Now, at my age, I can get away with that kind of pompous remark. So if I make the remark that it's on the biosphere, then it has to include everything. So please feel free to ask. Okay, social capital, very much so. Chapter 6 is devoted entirely to social capital, but we don't call it that. I talk about trust, and I talk about social norms and laws, legal rules, as being 2 alternative patterns of institutions, guiding institutions, and therefore the incentives people have for undertaking this or that. And so social capital then comes up, and there's huge literature on that, that I've summarized Putnam's work and the work that Sandee has done. In fact, that chapter has a lot of material from Sandee's work on the communities. In fact, if anything, I would argue that the review I'm proud of is the fact that I've introduced communities as a central institution, in addition to markets, government, and households, which that trio is what defines economics in textbooks. I've introduced communities and shown how communitarian management structures, i.e. the structure of behavior resulting from social norms, the implications of social norms, as opposed to the law, shapes lives and how that needs to be included in it. So then why is social capital missing from my trio of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, which say, for example, the UNEP books that I mentioned several times, have that trio, the same trio that I used to define inclusive wealth. Why is social capital missing? And the reason is that social capital is not quite a capital in that sense. It's really it's a characteristic of an economy. It's like trust is a characteristic of an economy, of a society, as is, or lack of trust, as it may be, the degree of trust, coherence of a society is a characteristic of a society. It's not society itself. Just as, for example, biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. If biodiversity declines, the productivity of an ecosystem declines. If trust in a society, amongst members in a society declines, productivity, the possibilities open to the society decline. The futures of people are reduced in some sense in terms of quality. Where will that show up in inclusive wealth? It'll show up in accounting prices. Take two islands, one in which there are sufficiently strong laws and there's trust so that households can trade amongst one another, exchange goods and services. And another where there's such mistrust that there's no trade. They're all autarkic households. Imagine that. I've used this analogy several times in my writings. Otherwise, imagine that the distribution of assets is the same in the two. They're identical islands. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart, except for the fact one is trading, the other is not, amongst one another. That is, okay. Well, what will their futures be? Their futures will be very different. The autarkic one will be basically stagnant, maybe even decline to nothing because you don't have the possibilities of exploiting the differences in talents that households have through trade. Okay, the other one will flourish. And that's picked up in, if you like, social capital. And therefore the prices, the shadow prices of the capital assets in the two islands, they will be very different, even though the identical distribution of assets, quantities of assets, because remember the islands are otherwise the same. Now, inclusive wealth in push bump sense will be different to the two. In the other island, it will be higher. Because inclusive wealth in it has maps, the accounting prices takes into account the future of the economy. That's what accounting prices are. You're asking, what is an asset going to do for the holder of the asset and for the rest of the community? So the accounting prices is the contribution of that asset to well-being across the generations. So social capital comes in through the back door as an institution. And if you ever read the original paper that Karl, Göran and I published in Environmental and Resource Economics in 2000, which introduced the idea of inclusive wealth, we called it, I can't remember what we called it, proper wealth or something, I don't know. Then Ken Arrow joined us in that research program. We then have 3 or 4 articles together, which extended the whole idea in a much more sharper way. And Ken decided to call it comprehensive wealth. And Bushman vetoed it, called it inclusive wealth. So that's okay. That's all right. Nomenclature doesn't bother me very much. But that's the situation. It doesn't include social capital for that very reason. Now, in principle, you could say, well, why not make it into a capital asset? You could, in principle, theoretically, you could. And then add it, but try and measure. There's a serious measurement problem. So there are many ways of thinking about what assets are. We think in terms of these 3 broad categories, and then the rest are lubricants. Trust is a lubricant of a society, and social capital is one. So that's one answer, one way. And inclusive, somebody pointed out to me just the other day that there is a danger of using the word inclusive these days, because at least in the West, the inclusive means, when you apply for a job, when you advertise for a job, you must be inclusive in when entertaining applicants so that there's no bias, on ethnic grounds, or you name it one. So there is a danger that by inclusive, that, it's not meant to do that. It's inclusive in as much as it includes natural capital. That's the only reason. And maybe comprehensive would have been the right one. At the moment, it's too late. Okay. Finally, percentage of adverse externalities in market prices, I have no idea. And the reason I have no idea, I have ideas from simple examples, case studies that have been undertaken by you all, including SANDEE people. There's the book that was published, I think, 2012 or so, from SANDEE on estimating accounting prices. By Enam and others. has lots of case studies of that kind, but of course, these are case studies. In my talk, I was concentrating attention on those where the externalities are so severe that the prices are zero, like in the open oceans, for example, the open access resources. So I couldn't tell you how much it is. Of course, to the extent that agricultural land is privatized, there are prices, but the spillovers of what the agriculture does to the rest of ecosystems, that's where the action is from our point of view. And I couldn't tell you what it is. It could be 10%, could be 15%. In some cases, it'll be 100%. If it's zero, of course. Okay. If you remove externalities and then for exports, okay, suppose you did that. Then, of course, by my reckoning, you're taking a different direction. You're charging the right price. When I say you, I mean the exporting country. Then to the extent that the price has gone up, to that extent, demand will fall for the importing country. My guess is that we are so hooked on primary products that maybe the demand is not very inelastic. It's more elastic than otherwise. So we can't tell what the revenue would be. But it would mean, of course, that the average income or the average expenditure of the average footprint of the importing country will go down. Other things equal, of course. That was what I was saying. So the idea is, in some sense, my review, I was very conscious. The idea was not to suggest what will happen if we get things right. I don't know. But what we do know is that we got to get the institutions right, the policies right. The direction of technological change is it's impossible to predict, okay? So I don't know what direction technological change will take if we have the right institutions in the sense of the kind that I've just been mentioning, and remove the distortions, if you like, that I've been mentioning with regard to natural capital, except for one thing. The new technologies will not be as offensive to nature as they are currently, for obvious reason, that entrepreneurs want to economize on the resources that they use, the assets that they require for their inventions. Okay, why would they wish to save on natural capital when so much of it is free? They would wish to save on labor. That's why you have labor-saving technologies, on capital asset, produced capital, and so forth. So innovations are going to be in the form of chainsaws. Okay, huge fishing gear to be able to exploit the open seas, because you're not paying for that right. So obviously you want to economize on the rate of return on private rate of return on investment in these big trawlers, which go and then zoom in on swarms of fish using extremely high quality technology. All that is geared to exploiting a zero price asset. So the direction of technological change will be very different from what is now. What will be the response in terms of new innovations? We can't tell, except for the fact that they will be much more nature friendly. They will have to be, for the simple reason nature will come at a price. And so that's why I resist talking about whether we should go for degrowth. With the degrowth is desirable, and Blankovich, I think, is the chap at the World Bank who talks about how the kind of discussion we are having here might lead people to think that when you go for inclusive wealth rather than GDP, you're going for degrowth, and degrowth means harming the poor and so forth. I think that's a wrong way of looking at things. It's the wrong way of looking at things is that I don't use expressions like degrowth or not. What we want to do is go for inclusive wealth, of course, because that's how we have, as I have argued, that's the thing that we go for, because it corresponds to intergenerational welfare. Whether that allied to the institutional reforms that I'm sketching here, and the review has in great length, whether that leads to degrowth, I do not know. It could be that our great-grandchildren will have much better lives than we do if we go the right route. We have no business to think that it's all going to be bad. We just have to make a huge turn in and maybe that huge turn has to come in small incremental steps. But ecological economics, or the reviews, the economics of the biosphere, is not against poverty. If anything, it highlights the poverty that is created by bad economics of growth and development and bad economics of poverty, which simply ignores the lives of the poor in a way that you all have illuminated over the past 20, 30 years. The review is great, is hugely influenced by the work our South Asian colleagues have produced, precisely because they've actually looked at the lives of the poorest people and they are asset managers, by the way. Boy, oh boy, are they asset managers. The fisherman, the person who works on the wetlands, collects rubbish and so forth. They are asset managers every day of the week. They will say we're trying to get the best return we can from our assets. So we've got to get the prices right.
Thank you. I'm flooded with questions here, so that's why sorry to interrupt you. And also I'm getting the reminder from the organizer, but I am tempted to take, with your permission, Partha, one more round of questions because we have plenty still. I will not throw all of them at you, but 2 or 3 maybe. That makes sense. Do you think you are okay with that?
Okay. My watch says we have 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So Purnamita is asking that in your review, you are saying that restoration is costlier than conservation. Do you have any particular ecosystem in mind? That is one. Second question is coming from Saudamini Das. She is saying, oh, COVID-19 minimized the ecological footprint. Will we call it a natural check in Malthusian words or Malthusian sense? That is her question. Then, as we all know, INSEE has been very global in its character and appeal. We have a colleague from Portugal asking Nuno Bento. And the question is, that is something we always struggle. How to incorporate the human development dimension into wealth accounts? Partially, tangentially, you have touched this issue, but again, I thought I can mention because this question keeps coming. Then there are several other questions, colleagues, which are more localized in nature and what is happening in my district or blocks or tahsil or state. In the interest of time, I'm not bringing them up, but I fully understand they are critically important issue. Now, then the question is from Amita Bregenza. It's a good reflection that Sir Partha, you put forth that free trade leads to a negative impact on poor countries. How much power would these poor countries in the tropics be able to wield vis-a-vis the developed countries in order to protect themselves in this regard, and especially in exploitation in this area? That question is relevant, although it goes or it transcends from economics to politics, but I thought I should mention this. I think still I have a long list, but I will stop here and over to you, Partha.
Okay, well, I'll start from the end. I didn't say free trade is bad for poor countries necessarily. I don't know all the other gains that they make. But what I was pointing to is that there's a transfer of wealth at the exporting side, okay, of primary products, of course, okay. Now, and the reason that's really damaging is that as they do that, they're essentially they're mining the natural capital. For example, deforesting in order to create, in the case of Malaysia, for example, palm oil and so forth. So I was looking at one part of the trade deal, which is the export part. Okay, so that's, I don't want to go from there to a larger scheme of is free trade good or bad for the poor countries. All I know is that free trade, the benefits of free trade can be established when there are complete markets. In the absence of complete markets, the theorem doesn't hold. I have given you an example where the theorem gives us a definite direction of bias arising out of opening up of trade. So you should be very cautious before we subscribe to free trade as the way, or opening up of trade as the way, the beneficial route for the world's poorest countries. I do not believe that to be the case at all. For the reason, as I say, they're fragile, already fragile ecosystems are more threatened to that. Human development and inclusive wealth. Yes, of course. The whole point about the theorem was the equivalence between wealth and well-being tells you that, yes, exactly right. Human development is built into the notion of inclusive wealth. Because remember, the two are marching step by step together. One increases, the other increases. So I'm looking at intergenerational well-being that includes whatever notion of human development you have in mind, goes without saying. That's exactly right. So you give me your notion of human development in terms of, and when I say human development, across the generations, and I'll give you a set of accounting prices such that inclusive wealth moves in tandem with your notion of human development. So let's not make any mistake. It's there because the equivalence theorem is telling us that that's what it is. Human development includes material objects and non-material objects, both as means and ends. And the asset structure are, if you like, the means through which everything follows. Without these assets, we're done for. We are part of the biosphere, and the biosphere is the capital asset we're trying to measure. And the inclusive wealth is precisely that. COVID-19 Malthusian footprint. Yes, COVID-19 has reduced the footprint levels, and I think that's probably correct. Yes, but the presence of the occurrence of COVID-19 is an indication that we have essentially broken an evolutionary experience of we mean the human economy, of entering every conceivable ecological niche. We didn't evolve with every ecological niche. We today can enter anywhere, whether it's 25,000 feet at the bottom of the sea, or whether it's 8 miles up. We're there. We're there in the rainforest. We can mine anything and we enter it all. And that has meant that we have entered into terrains with which we have no evolutionary contact and therefore resistance to the diseases. After all, these viruses exist in animals and they're not exactly dying necessarily. They have evolved with it, co-evolved with them. We haven't co-evolved with many. So it's a symptom of the problems that we are entering into. Is it Malthusian? I don't know. My review does not have any metaphors. I don't believe in doing economics through metaphors or colorful phrases like circular economy, or largely because if somebody says circular economy, I know any number of my colleagues will say, of course, we can have expanding circles. So, all right, so everything needs to be regenerated, but technological change can expand the circle. So that's the answer to that question, okay? So one reason I'm very minded to take theory very seriously, because you can't cut corners. Whether it's Malthusian or not, I don't know. I haven't read Malthus well enough. I think my guess is he had the intuition for overreaching our ability to handle the biosphere. How he got that intuition, I do not know. After all, ecology was a very in advanced state of his time. To that extent, yes, this will be a Malthusian claim, absolutely, that we're overreached the demand. In my impact inequality, you could call that Malthusian, if you like, but it's coming through lack of markets and its externalities, remember. So I'm using modern economic thinking to come to a conclusion which may resemble Malthus, for all I know. But the starting point is not Malthus, nowhere near, because I don't know enough of Malthus. Restoration costlier than prevention. What does that mean? And well, it's actually comes straight from the fact that so much of investment is irreversible. One reason we worry about climate change is, just imagine, for the sake of argument, that 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level, mean temperature, had taken place, let's say, 500 years ago, for some reason or the other, never mind. So you would have had more extreme events then than people did 500 years ago. Then the direction of capital investment would have been very different. The structure of our cities, the buildings that we create and so forth, we would have adapted to a wilder, atmospheric conditions, as it were. When we worry about sea level rising and covering over cities and the coastline, it's a reflection of the fact that those are irreversible investments. We can't take those buildings and put it, on higher ground. We have to reconstruct our buildings. rebuild, as it were, when they go under. So irreversibility is extremely important. And of course, Mother Nature's irreversibility, when a species goes extinct, it cannot be recovered. That's irreversible. So it's irreversibility, which is the context in which I use the expression restoration is more expensive than preservation. But of course, preservation or conservation has with it also a cost. And the cost being that we're not doing something we would otherwise do, like building a highway system, let's say, over a wetland. All right, so that is a cost. The point about it is that if the wetland is destroyed by the highway system, then we discover that the wetland was very valuable. Then recovering the wetland is going to be very costly. So that's the basis of that argument. It has to do with irreversibility of investment. If capital was fungible everywhere, like in the solo model, let's say, then I wouldn't be talking like this.
Excellent. We do have some questions, but forgive me, those participants who have sent the questions. Maybe there could be other opportunities, or we can be on email and see whether those questions can be addressed. I don't intend to make a summary of what Sir Partha has presented here, but a couple of things we need to keep in mind. Why we are talking about this wealth and income, because wrongly or by some historical accident, GDP is taken as the proxy to the welfare measurement or sustainability measurement. And that's why we need to re-examine that. And as Partha himself always says, and that appeals to people everywhere, that look, you are not going to pass your income to the next generations. If we talk about intergenerational equity, then it is the wealth. Maybe in the current, your income can generate some assets, and that assets can be passed to the future, but certainly income itself cannot be passed to the future generations. So we must keep track of our assets of all types, of course, and certainly natural assets or natural capital, because the way, as he has shown, in the last few decades, we have amassed, produced wealth or the human capital that has been done, unfortunately, at the cost of natural capital. And that is what you have seen from that graph, that it is continuously on decline. But mind it, there are many other forms of capital, natural capital, I mean, they are not into this data. If we include, probably the scenario will be much more intimidating than what it appears now. And also we are in pandemic. I mean, this kind of pandemic, I mean, we are lucky that we have the vaccine, or at least some part has the vaccine, but we are talking like this. We are not meeting over a cup of tea and, you know, as we used to do in the old days. This is, and that source, it is definitely climate change, habitat fragmentation, illegal trade of bushmeat, and many other anthropogenic activities which has brought these unwanted pathogens from wild to the humans. And please remember, this may not be the last one. We have been getting warnings, SARS, Ebola, Zika, but this time we were not lucky. The rest is history. So we need to correct this dysfunctional relationship between nature and man, and assessing natural capital and accounting them into our practical decisions could be the right way, or one of the ways to address the problem which we all are confronting with. And that is why it is not surprising that at the decision-making levels, if you think about UN, just to put my UN cap here, there has been a continuous demand from the governments, from the head of the states and politicians, that we need, there is something wrong in the GDP when we start taking it as a proxy to sustainability. So whether it is SDG, go to MDG, or Rio +20, the future we want, and all the documents, they talk about it. Now, the Secretary General himself is very keen that wealth and natural capital should be as the essential agenda for the governments in 2023 when we have the summit, the sustainable future, which will be along with the General Assembly, as you know. And today, as you know, governments, even in this fractured polycentric world, there is only one body which provides the lamp post to the 7-8 billion people, 200 countries with different aspiration and ambition. And that's why flagging of this issue in the event that inclusive wealth, natural capital is the way forward, is a real test of the pudding of the research which Sir Partha and Karl Goran and many others have done in last 4 to 5 decades. We are so lucky that the person who has done it, who has not only but tried, he has taken, Partha, you have taken great pain to communicate this idea to the politicians and the bureaucrats. Unfortunately, they have the clout to make an impact on the ground. And I think that in every sense tells us that is the true worth of ecological economics, which you have conveyed, and you have demonstrated how a certain idea can be put into practice. So hats off to you. We really hope you have a long, healthy life to talk to us like this. We all are selfish, and I think wish you all the best, happy holidays, and my best wishes for the new year to you and to all our INSEE colleagues. I will stop.
Thank you. Just to wrap up, thank you, Pushpam. Thank you, Partha. I've always said this has been a Promethean endeavor, and I will just say 3 things. One is housekeeping, but the first comment is that I will lie awake at night thinking about the other 0.6 Earth, since we need 1.6 Earths and we just have 1. So I have got to worry about where that other 0.6 will come from. Also, this may sound facetious, but this is actually a very serious comment that, several South Asians have been making their trip to Stockholm. And I think it is about time that, this is a really important message for our profession, that there's another South Asian who needs to make that trip just because this issue has to be really highlighted. So, and I'm saying this with all seriousness about the state of our profession and how priorities get created. So I do hope that one sees you making that long overdue trip. And of course, we are just day 1 of our INSEE conference, and we have 2 more days. We have several interesting plenaries going on. And now it's my pleasant duty, Partha, to invite you to a glass of Cabernet virtually. We are well. I owe you that glass of wine. It's
you do, and not virtually, but there you go.
So yes, absolutely. It's going to be nothing but the very best. And I know it's getting close to your lunchtime. For us, we are moving into our social event. So all of you who are here, please segue right into, there is a different Zoom link, but this is now party time, 6 p.m. in Delhi. So please move into the social room, just open your videos. Partha, you can join, or your lunch awaits you, your glass of sherry awaits you. So please, thank you very much. Thanks both of you, Pushpam, for such a brilliant job, and Partha again. So I then would like to formally close this meeting, and we will have this on YouTube. So
thank you so much. Bye-bye. All the best for the
Thank
season.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.